Arr, me mateys, what be your favourite part of a pirate's tale? I sure hope it's quantum physics and imperialism, because that's what we're taking a whack at today. Welcome back, everybody, to me doing Pirate Winter, which is me talking about pirate stories as long as my teeth are still fucked up, which is at least for a couple of days more. And today we'll be talking about On Stranger Tides by Tim Powers, which came out in 1987, was licensed for a Pirates of the Caribbean movie, but we're talking about the book today. But before we do that, I have to give out a personalized cheers and toast. And this is to my new channel member, Joe. This one's for you. Cheers. If you want one of those personalized cheers, well, you can join the Patreon or you can become a channel member, and then you'll get one of those every now and then. And with that out of the way, let's get cracking and talk about first, well, what the book is in a quick synopsis, and then go into more detailed and spoilery talk afterwards. As I already mentioned, this is a book published in 1987. It follows mostly the exploits of one Jean Chandonniac, who is on his way to Haiti to find his uncle, who stole a lot of money from his now dead father. And on the way there, he gets entangled with pirates and has to go on some noble quests to save a lady and possibly find the Fountain of Youth. He also runs into Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet and a lot of other famous pirates on the way. Oh, and there's magic, because this is obviously historical fantasy and not just historical fiction. It has everything you want from a pirate story, but it may not be the most gripping pirate tale you've ever come across, because it does meander somewhat. However, I think it's still worthwhile reading, because it does do a lot of the things that Tim Powers generally does. So that's the quick synopsis here. This takes place in 1718, at the end of the golden age of piracy. Alright, let's talk about spoilers and all of that stuff. So what we'll do is first look at what Tim Powers does in his novels in general, then we'll look at historical novels, what historical fiction does, and then we move further into the magic part, and then we hopefully bring this all together near the end. Alright, what does Tim Powers do? Tim Powers writes a lot of historical fantasy novels. Usually what he does is he picks a specific part of history, looks at all the small bits and pieces that don't necessarily add up in the records that we have, and then comes up with a magical explanation of how all of this does actually work. And that's a really clever formula. It makes a lot of sense, it's fun, when it works really well. For example, in his novel Declare, he takes the communist double agents around Guy Burgess and Kim Philby, the Cambridge Five, and links their defection and so forth to the existence of Genie and Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, and writes all of that in the format of what you might call your Cold War spy thriller. And it works really, really well. Honestly, read that book, it's good. Here, he takes, obviously, the golden age of piracy and adds some form of quantum physics-based magic to find reasons why, Stede Bonnet went back to pirating, why Blackbeard made some really stupid choices that led to his death, and a lot more around all of that. And that's where things do sometimes fall apart. So, let's look at the first part here, and that is historical fiction. This is, as I said, historical fiction with a magical supernatural element added to it. But it does still adhere to the rules of historical fiction. That means you do historical research, and you have sources, and you have possibly current research data, academic stuff that you can look upon. Everyone does that. Now, the problem is, of course, that sources are biased because they're written by people who have something to say in that specific moment in history and don't necessarily write these things down for historians. And, of course, historical research and historiography is also biased because it is always a reflection of the people that are writing and trying to make sense of things that have happened in the past. It also obviously changes when new sources are discovered, new things are found out, and so forth. And you'll see how all of these two things kind of come together with On Stranger Tides. Let's start with the first part, and that is historical sources. Now, we've already spoken about that. There's not that many sources for pirates in the 18th century, because, they were busy doing something else. We have a lot of sort of narratives by some former pirate captains later on, but they're not that many. There are basically two main narrative sources, and then there are court documents. Court documents obviously are very much biased because, it's about people who are writing down that they are going to hang a bunch of pirates at Execution Dock or somewhere else. So they are by nature very much biased, and they have maybe a few confessions and a few witness reports, but that's all there is to it. The other big source, and the one that has arguably had the most impact on how we see pirates today, are a few narrative histories. There's basically two. The first one is The Buccaneers of America by Alexander Exquemelin, or however you pronounce his name, who spent some time amongst the buccaneers in the 17th century and wrote about that. He's the one who got sued for libel by Henry Morgan because he called Henry Morgan a pirate. Interesting, right? The other one is, of course, The General History of the Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson, who is a pseudonym for someone we don't know who. Some people claim it's Daniel Defoe, but currently, as far as I'm aware, the consensus in academia is that he's not the actual author. He wrote some other books about pirates, though. Those are like the main narrative sources that have basically built the idea of what pirates in the Caribbean and around that time looked like, all the way until Stevenson wrote Treasure Island, roughly. I mean, he also took bits and pieces from those sources, and mostly The General History of the Pirates. Tim Powers uses those very explicitly. On the one hand, the description of cooking on the beach and so forth, all of that stuff is more taken from the Buccaneers of America, I would argue. And when it comes to The General History of the Pirates, which is mostly a collection of biographies of famous pirates, including Blackbeard, Stede Bonnet, Anne Bonny, Calico Jack Rackham, and Mary Read, he picks pieces and details from that one. And that's where things become problematic. I'll take one example here that I think is really important, and that is the story of Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny is probably the most famous female pirate that we know, woman pirate that we know of, and her story is part of The General History of the Pirates, together with the story of Mary Read. And this is where stuff gets complicated, because these are narrative sources. These lie at the beginning of myth-making around pirates. And Mary Read and Anne Bonny are sort of posed against each other in that narrative. They both sail with the crew of Calico Jack Rackham. We know they existed from witness statements around the trial of Jack Rackham, but the main part we get is from The General History of the Pirates. And what we get there is that Mary Read is basically the good girl. She has to disguise herself as a man, work as a soldier, and so forth. She falls in love, she marries, and so forth. She is monogamous and is basically forced into piracy by external circumstances, as far as we know. Now, very little of this is something we can actually historically prove, so take already that with a lot of salt. On the other hand, Anne Bonny is the bad girl. She marries a sailor, James Bonny or Jim Bonny, against her father's wishes. She decides to go pirating. She does all of this on her own. She tries to get divorced, sort of divorced from Jim, and try to hook up with other pirates, including Jack Rackham near the end. She's described as a very much sexually active, promiscuous, violent. She's the bad girl. Now, the problem is that Anne Bonny comes up in this book on the island of New Providence, where we know she stayed before she joined up with Calico Jack Rackham, and where she stayed with Jim Bonny. And if that's the only source you can use, which is exactly what Tim Powers did, you get an Anne Bonny that is very promiscuous, constantly tries to seduce or just, ignore any form of consent with our main character, Jean Chandonniac, and so forth. But that's already like a very specific narrative that is not questioned when used as just that one source. And I wanted to bring this one up as an example of where this approach kind of fails. Now, there are obviously other elements here. The problem with Anne Bonny is that since she's just one of two female characters that we get in this book, because there's very few female characters, and the other one is Beth Herwood, the love interest of Jean Chandonniac, who basically is very passive for plot reasons and then gets rescued at the end. We once again follow that sort of posing with Beth Herwood basically taking over the role of Mary Read in that specific narrative, which is a highly problematic narrative. So this is one thing I wanted to bring up. The other part about writing historical fiction that we will come back to later as well is, of course, picking individual small bits and pieces and dropping those research elements. For example, the story of how Blackbeard shoots Israel Hands, which is told in the General History of the Pirates, comes up in this book basically verbatim the way it was described in General History of the Pirates. And that, gives the impression of Tim Powers having done his research. Another part is, of course, more like general facts. The idea that for a while in post-Reformation Germany, there was a ban on live actors, which allowed a lot of people to become puppeteers, because puppet shows were still legal, because no human actors. And that is part of Jean d'Arnac's background, historical one, and character background. And it shows that Tim Powers has done his research in this specific part, and that helps establish the authority of the narrator, of the story, and of the book in a lot of ways. This obviously also falls down at some point if you kind of get it wrong. And we'll come back to that later on, because there is one thing that is historically inaccurate that does massively matter, and that's the terminology of the place that in Haiti. I mentioned it earlier, he sails to Haiti. Haiti in 1718 was still a French colony. It was still called Saint-Domingue, but it is called Haiti within the text, which you can argue is because not every reader knows about how that changed with the slave rebellion and all of that stuff. But it certainly leads to some consequences if this story kinda is a narrative around imperialism, which is where we need to go very clearly next. So what we have learned so far is it is a story based on historical sources, and these historical sources are highly biased and can lead to some unfortunate depictions if you don't question them too much. Now let's look at the next part, which is of course research. In the late 70s and early 80s, and up to the to end 80s, the new interpretation of piracy was an anti-imperialist. Post-colonialism and anti-imperialism were relatively new, or were just making their way out of very specialized parts of academia into the larger consensus, and that certainly led to a re-evaluation of what pirates were doing and what piracy was doing. And Tim Powers goes with that. A large narrative, and we'll come back to that throughout this video, is that pirates living at the edge of an empire were opposing the continental European empires, those being Spain, France, potentially, and obviously England at the time. And there is certainly some truth to that, but it's a very clear framing that is rooted in that specific time. Now, this just dates Tim Powers' narrative to the mid-80s, and there's nothing more I can, it's not me blaming him for anything, it's just pointing this out. This is important to understand, however, because this does impact how your book, if you're relying on historical research, will age. So that's the first part. We have very specific sources that are already very much in the process of myth-making, following and establishing specific tropes of the pirate story that are then perpetuated through books like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and a ton of movies and other pirate stories all the way to the 1980s, and we have a very specific form of academia that we have at the same time. That's the pirate stuff. That's the historical stuff. Now let's look at the magic. I already mentioned that Tim Powers uses magic as a way to explain certain open questions in the behavior of, or the documented behavior of certain historical figures. In this case, mostly Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet, and the end of their respective careers. And we have, once again, bits and pieces in here in the story that work well. For example, there is a, historical mention that Blackbeard had 14 or 15 wives, which obviously, one after the other, which obviously raises the question, what's going on there? And magic is one way that Tim Powers manages to explain this small little detail. Once again, this is how he operates in a lot of ways, and how he takes historical details and thus proves his research and creates a interesting story. So now we need to talk about magic, and this is somewhat problematic because the magic we have here is a quantum uncertainty, quantum physics based sort of way of reshaping the world on the quantum level by imposing your willpower on subatomic particles that are still undecided in their state, in their state in a lot of ways. That's roughly how it works. It's kind of connected to iron and so forth, which allows magic to work outside of the imperial core and not so much in the imperial core. All of this kind of makes sense. The problem is what kind of story you build if you make these first basic choices. And that leads to some unfortunate elements at the end of the story. So the main magicians we have in this book are all continental Europeans. That is obviously Professor Herwood and his assistant, rival, and so forth, Leo Friend. And, of course, Blackbeard, who may or may not be born European and in continental Europe and grew up on Jamaica or not. The book claims he just grew up on Jamaica. Anyway, my point is, it's white men doing the kind of white man's magic they used to do in continental Europe that only works in the New World now because their, society is still rather unformed. And you can read this certainly as a form of criticism of imperialism. It reinforces the themes that are kind of tied into the reading of pirates at the time Powers was writing this book. We take European stories, tell them in the New World. We take these places which are already obviously inhabited by a lot of people, and we basically mine them for their resources, whether that is coffee, tobacco, sugar, or in this case magic. Doesn't necessarily matter. And as such, it does definitely work. He just doesn't go necessarily far enough to make it clear that the way magic is used on the imperial edge, there, so to speak, is still an act of imperial aggression and forcing European narratives and European stories on a place that is inhabited, that has indigenous people living there, native people living there, has transplanted people from Africa who are slaves or freed slaves and so forth, all in this place living, that are once again forced to work according to white continental European narratives, which is still what's going on. The story of Herwood being obsessed with the death of his wife and doing all the terrible things that he does to bring her back shows that grief is a key motivator to do inhuman things and again inhuman power, which is what Herwood does. It's also a very classic European tale of magicians becoming obsessed with grief and grief as a motivator to do magic. Same for Leo Friend, who is obviously a different narrative. There's a difference between those two, and we'll talk about that now, or basically now. Because while we have the traditional classic European narrative, and we see that in the prologue where it's tied to Odysseus calling up of Achilles' ghost in the Odyssey, we see that it's always the same form of magic basically, and we tie Herwood to that as a representative of like the old elites of continental England. Friend does something different. Friend is very much defined through his psychology, and this is another part that doesn't necessarily age well, because the model of explanation that Tim Powers uses here is Freudian psychoanalysis and linking the need to do magic to a massive Oedipus complex, which is certainly something that is not necessarily what you might call the current state of the art of psychology, but it leads to a very awkward depiction of Leo Friend, which is then tied into him also having no control over anything of his body, which means he's incredibly obese, and that is always described as like he doesn't know how to have any form of self-discipline. And while that ties in with Freudian psychoanalysis, it's also incredibly harmful stereotypes about overweight people in a lot of ways. And this is what I mean by the cost of certain decisions that Tim Powers takes for this book that lead to unfortunate outcomes. And that's the same thing with that, like, magic being used as sort of like a metaphor for imperialism, because he does still silence all non-white voices, right? He does still... We have a few black characters who are using magic, but they're very much on the periphery of our narrative. This is still very much settled on just white dudes doing white magic, and that's a problem if the lens you're using magic through, even though you establish in the beginning that it's the same form of magic that Odysseus used in Greece, that you're now using the vocabulary of voodoo or Vaudin, which is once again also a product of imperialism, in that it is obviously the mix and the result of transplanting different people from Africa to the New World, to the Caribbean, forcing them through slavery and bringing them into contact with Catholicism and local Taino and other native beliefs, and leading to all of that. But it's only white people using that and not going far enough to sort of making it explicit that this form of imperialism, that it's still a form of imperialism, and it's bad. Because this is where the whole thing kind of ties together, right? the idea that all pirates are anti-imperialist, and these are still white people fighting the white empires that they came from, is a framing that does not hold up. We now know that pirates, being on the borders of empires, were also a tool for imperialism. Sometimes they were certainly fighting against it, sometimes they were fighting for an empire, sometimes they were fighting for one empire against another. So the overarching plot of establishing a pirate society under Blackbeard, which is then obviously not done, to oppose all those continental empires, rings somewhat hollow because it's still white people putting their will over the people that already live there, the non-white people. And that is, it's very culturally insensitive in a way, and it's unfortunate, and I think it's kind of tied to the lens that Tim Powers chose to use here. Now, before we end, we need to talk about one sort of final part here, and that is, once again, historical details and mythology. I already mentioned that pirate stories are a form of modern myth and follow certain mythological conventions. Some of them were laid down and established already in, of course, General History of the Pirates and the Buccaneers of America. They were then picked up by people like Robert Louis Stevenson in Treasure Island, then, used and retold through operas, musicals, stage shows, movies, radio plays, novels, and all of that stuff. And that established a very specific things that need to be done to make a story feel like a pirate story. And because Tim Powers is always choosing a specific genre to tell a story in, that is also a homage or takes place in that specific literary genre, On Stranger Tides has to adhere to the expectations of a pirate story, the same way that Declare has to adhere to the expectations of a Cold War spy thriller like the ones by John le Carré. And that's a problem, because that means he has to put a lot of certain of elements in there that may not necessarily make the plot less convoluted. Take, for example, ghost ships. A lot of pirate stories do have ghost ships. It's just one of those things. So we get a scene with a ghost ship in this book. That is not necessary. It's not necessary. It just leads to another plot twist to move further on. The same way we need to have Jean d'Arnac, run over a table and do some classic swashbuckling stuff in that regard. We need to have all of these elements in there, and that makes the whole plot feel almost like it's too much. There's too much stuff happening just to have set piece scenes that need to be in there to make this feel piratey, that don't necessarily add to the actual plot or character development. And that is certainly a problem. The same way that we have, obviously, very few female characters. I already mentioned Anne Bonny, which is the problem of the sources, and we have Beth Herwood, who is, mostly an object and objectified by her father and also by Jean d'Arnac up to a point. And, you can make that specific choice, but if your one other woman character is Anne Bonny as a relatively misogynist depiction of a strong woman, that doesn't work well, because mythologies and myths do sometimes have negative and problematic elements. And this is kind of where I want to end this. This book is not necessarily explicitly sexist, misogynist, or so forth, but by adhering to both a very scanty historical record that is already very narrativized and biased by the time it was written in, and then picking very specific elements from the historiography afterwards, it leads to a very specific form of story that does not read very well at the end of the day. And I think that at the heart of this lies one conflict with a story like Piracy, which we have very scant historical records, but a lot of mythology. It is probably not possible to write a very historically accurate pirate story without writing a pirate myth. And for that, you need to actually lean into the mythic dimension, the mythological dimension, and not so much the historical dimension. On Stranger Tides is kind of trapped between those two poles, and Tim Powers is unable to bring them together in the way that he is sometimes able to do with other novels. So the question is, should you just write a historically accurate pirate story, or one that is mythologically accurate? And that's what we'll talk about in the next one when we talk about The Pirates by George MacDonald Fraser, which leans in on the pirate myth. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have read the book, let me know your thoughts down below. Like, subscribe, share, do all of those wonderful things. Join the Patreon or the channel if you want a personal cheers like Joe. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one, and until then, thanks and cheers.